It's time to take care of business on Kern Radio Newstalk 1180. Once again, here are your hosts, Marty Pay and Clay Kerner.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
So incredible about that speech. This is Kern Radio Newstalk 1180. Clay and Marty, and in studio we have Keith Wolaridge, Damon Smothers, and Michael Bowers. Incredible thing about that speech is he was assassinated the next day.
The next day.
Incredible. You talk about being a prophet. Keith, you were going to answer that long-winded question I had?
No, that's an excellent question. One, I have been faced with that query on more than one occasion. And again, my mother and I were having breakfast this morning, and I asked her the question. And if you don't mind, before there was Martin and Malcolm, there was Megger. Mm-hmm. And Megger was down in Gut Bucket, Mississippi, dealing with these issues. But to answer your question, why there's been this transformation, we have to remember, President Eisenhower had civil rights legislation that was on the table. And there was a presidential election in 1960 between Mr. Richard Nixon and Senator John F. Kennedy at the time. Mm-hmm. I just got through finishing reading the book, My Life with Martin, during Black History Month by Coretta. So if anybody had a first-hand place at the table, it would be, Mother Scott, Mother King. So she talks about what had happened, because Daddy King, Martin's father, was very involved in the civil rights movement from the 40s and 50s there in Atlanta, Georgia. But there was one time Martin was arrested on some nefarious charges, and he was shipped off in the dark of midnight to this prison there in some place in Georgia. Well, Daddy King made a phone call to his friends in high places, and the person who made the phone call, now please understand, Daddy King was going to be a Nixon supporter in that election. But the person who made the phone call to relieve Martin of his pain of that jail cell was John F. Kennedy. So as a result, Daddy King switched his political juice and said, well, look, people of the South, it wasn't Nixon who made the phone call to get Martin out of jail. It was John F. Kennedy. Now understand, John F. Kennedy did not support the civil rights legislation that Eisenhower had.
Right.
So it was a political ploy and a political move on his part that, guess what, won him the election.
Right.
So
exactly.
As a report, now let's think about this, those of us that are in politics. Those who support you, you have a tendency to support them. So let's fast forward the time scale. Kennedy, he was tenuous at best with civil rights legislation. He had some things on the books, but he just couldn't move them forward. And then that fateful day in November when he was slain. As you know, black folks took that extremely hard, the day he was shot and the day he was killed.
But the day he was killed, in a way, could be construed as a blessing, because that's the only way Johnson could have got all that legislation through.
I'm getting there.
Okay.
I'm getting there. You asked me the question why over the last 50 years.
Right.
So Johnson's now in office. Now 64, not so much has happened. We got the civil rights legislation that was signed, that was going forward. But then 68 comes around where Johnson is again. He's in this election, I do believe, with Goldwater.
Well, was it 64?
Was it 64?
64?
Forgive me,
yeah.
Again. 64 with Goldwater. So black folks, when you say states' rights, that equivalates to segregation
Right.
with African Americans.
Right, exactly.
Okay?
Yep.
So African Americans see things from a federal standpoint that we can't allow and rely and wait on states to give us what we've been marching for. And they see somebody at the federal government level, vis-a-vis Johnson, saying, all right, I'm pushing this legislation. Ergo, Dr. King supports Johnson. Again, federal, state, civil rights legislation. We're not waiting on states, federal government. That's where the change began. I read an article that said the call that changed the nation, the phone call that changed the nation, was when John F. Kennedy made that phone call to those people in Georgia to release Dr. King. That was the beginning of the shift. And it took, and I don't want to give all the credit to Dr. King, and Johnson. There was a guy by the name of Durskin, Republican in Illinois.
He was the leader of the House at that time.
He worked extremely hard. That man took courage for him to do what he did to get that legislation passed. So as a Republican, it was a bipartisan effort because you can't get anything done in Congress without both sides of the aisle doing anything. Durskin had courage to do what he did. So it took some efforts on Johnson, took some efforts with King, it took some efforts with Durskin. It was all of those gentlemen working together. But as we know, when we see the federal government from a African American standpoint, that was the change. We see that as why our party has gone that way. They see the federal government, not so much me, these three gentlemen here, but you asked about black people in whole.
Sure.
They see the federal government as being the catalyst and the reason for their freedom, not so much the governor of Mississippi, Alabama, Illinois, Louisiana, Florida, Georgia,
Right.
Carolinas. That's the reason why.
Okay. We're having a conversation with Keith Wolaridge, Damon Smothers, and Michael Bowers on Taking Care of Business, Kern Radio Newstalk 1180. Damon, did you want to add to that, or?
No, I think he did extremely well.
Okay,
I can't add a thing.
Michael's shaking his head. Okay. But, okay, let me expand on that question a little bit, okay? Because you're looking at, and you and I have talked about this before, conservatives in some areas of the country have a habit of putting their foot in their mouth when it comes to race relations.
Many times.
Many times.
Yes.
Yeah, many times. Which has got to make your job even tougher.
It's funny. Michael and I had this conversation. When you are an African American conservative, we walk on this line. I cannot disrespect black Democrats or Democrats as a whole because my family's a long line. I can't talk about them in a derogatory way because that'd be talking about my grandmother. Okay, I can't do that. My Uncle Tommy, my Uncle Victor, I can't do that. And then at the same time, I do espouse to the conservative values. But when I hear a racist joke at a CRA convention, that doesn't help.
Right, exactly.
It doesn't, and it has happened to me.
Sure.
So I stay professional,
Yeah.
and I may grin and I may nod, but also know, come on now, we got to do better than this. But at the same time, I got to go home to the family reunion.
Sure.
And hear the jokes that go on about that.
Right, exactly. Damon?
And I think Keith understands that, Michael, about my apprehension and frustration with the party. I've been in positions where I think that I could have gotten things done more, gotten things done faster. Someone asked me, well, have you ever wished you were white? In certain issues, I wish I was. I think that sometimes when we're trying to get certain things done, the color of our skin, regardless of what party we belong to, holds us back. And that's unfortunate because I see the bigger picture. Everyone knows that my cause is about children and helping kids. And if I could turn blank tomorrow and be another ethnicity to get that cause and have things happen positively for them, I would do it in a second. Not giving up on my folks, but I mean, that's just, I have to get this thing done. And I think when you're led by God to do something like I feel that I have, I'll do whatever it takes. And that's a mission that I have to suffer. But it's been something that's been given. So, I mean, I have a serious issue with some of the things that's been going on with the party, and we've talked about the issue with Obama. And I told folks, you can disagree with his philosophy and ideology, but you don't have to discredit the man. And that's the thing that I think goes. You won't bring any African Americans over if you disrespect the first African-American man to be president of the United States of America. That is the biggest thing that's ever happened to us as African-Americans. And to discredit him is a slap in the face of anyone, and in my opinion, conservative, liberal, humanitarian, whatever. It doesn't matter. So maybe I'm crazy. I don't know.
No, that makes sense. I understand where you're coming from with that. Let me ask you a related question.
Mm-hmm.
In 1968, Dr. King was assassinated in Memphis. I was stationed there when I was in the Marines in 1970, about a year and a half later. And there's an entire area of Memphis, Beale Street, home of the blues.
Home of the blues.
Yep. That was off limits.
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't. Any military man could not go there. A friend of mine and I, who happened to be black, he and I chummed together. We ended up going down there playing pool.
Mm-hmm.
That was our pool spot. One night we're down there. He said, "You know, you're the only white guy for about 2 miles." And you're smiling. And he looked at me and he said, he had my sense of humor, obviously. He said, "How's it feel?"
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
Yeah. And, you know, I'll tell you what. I have never forgotten that.
Mm-hmm.
There is never a time I'm in a meeting when I met you guys, you know, where that thought doesn't cross my mind.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's, and especially in your case, being conservative,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you're a minority in a minority.
Right.
Right.
So it's, I don't know if you guys want to comment on that, but it's a, Mike?
Well, you know, essentially when you look at it, it's, you know, you with your Republican parties, and Keith made a comment that, you know, you hear some of the, you know, the jokes on one end, and then when you go to your family reunion, you hear the Uncle Tom jokes. So you're caught in a pickle. And there's a quote I have on my Facebook that essentially says, "I'd rather be hated for who I am than to be loved for who I'm not." And that's the message I want to mimic, and it's hard and tight at sometimes, especially when you have people like Damon Dunn, who could have gotten a little bit more support from the local conservative party and from the state conservative party, and then you look at other Republicans that happen to be African American.
Let's pick up on that when we get back. This is Kern Radio Newstalk 1180, taking care of business. We'll be right back.